Hello and welcome to Biology Explained. Today we're going to be looking at dihybrid crosses. Now I've already done a video on monohybrid crosses, so if you want to go over those or want to learn what they are, please go and watch that first before coming to watch this video, as it will make it much easier to understand what is going on. Now we already know that genetic diagrams show the characteristics an individual can inherit, but all we've done previously in monohybrid crosses is look at one specific gene and how an offspring can inherit these genes or combinations of genes, let's say, from their parents. But we can also use a more complicated genetic diagram to show how more than one characteristic is inherited from your parents to the offspring. What we want to be able to work out is the chances of an offspring inheriting certain combinations of a characteristic. For example, we could use a dihybrid cross to look at how two different genes are inherited at the same time. Basically, it's more complicated than a monohybrid cross, but also it's basically just an extra large monohybrid cross that's slightly more difficult to understand, but once you understand how it works, it's not very complicated. So what we're going to look at is a P example. We're going to look at seed texture and color, which are both different, controlled by different genes, but we're going to look at how they kind of work together to create a specific ratio of pea plants in the offspring. Now, first of all, for a question like this, you need to know the parents' genotypes. And the possible genes we have are for a round seed or a wrinkled seed. That's one gene with two different alleles, round or wrinkled. And we also have a color gene, which is either yellow or green, depending on which allele it has. So it's two genes with two alleles each that could be passed from the parent to the offspring. And we're saying the round seed, big R, is the dominant one, so we'll take precedence over wrinkled, little r, which is the recessive gene, allele for that gene. And then for the color, we're saying yellow is dominant over green, which means yellow would take precedence over green if you had a combination of those two alleles. So for this example, we're saying the parents' genotypes are heterozygous. That means for each of these two genes, they have one of each of the alleles. So for the round gene, they have one dominant big R for round and one recessive little r for wrinkled. But because big R is dominant, that is the one that is in the phenotype. And then they also have the gene for seed color, which is also heterozygous. So they have a big Y for yellow seed and a little y recessive for green seed. But because big Y is there, it's dominant over the recessive one. So these seeds are yellow. And so for the sake of this example, both parents are going to be heterozygous because it's important to know what happens when a heterozygous cross occurs. And normally for a question like this is what it will get you to do, a heterozygous cross. But you've got to be careful. If it gives you the parents' genotypes, just make sure it hasn't done any homozygous genes or anything like that to catch you off guard, which is a possibility. So now we know what the parents' genotypes are, we can work out what different alleles they produce. That's just where it gets a little bit more complicated compared to a monohybrid cross, because we can have more combinations of different alleles than before. In this case, 4 different types of gamete that could be produced. So we could have dominant R for round seed paired with either dominant Y or recessive Y. So that's 2 different gametes. Or we could have the recessive wrinkled seed gene allele combined with either the yellow seed allele, which is the dominant allele, or the recessive green seed allele. And so they're the 4 different gametes that could be produced by these parents. This applies for both parents because they're both heterozygous. Again, you've got to be careful. If one of them is not heterozygous, they will produce a different combination of gametes. If one of them, let's say, was homozygous for both these genes, they could only ever produce one gamete. And that would be, let's say they're homozygous dominant for both. That would be big R, big Y. That was the only gamete they could produce, which would make the cross very simple. But this is almost the worst case example, is both heterozygous, because you've got to do a lot more drawing out in the question. So now we know what all the possible gametes are produced by the parents. We can put them in this table. We can write them in this table nice and neatly. And if you write it like this, it's hard to go wrong. So make sure you always do it so it's clear, and then you can simply count up the numbers. So in this case, if we're looking at the phenotypic ratio, which is the outward expression of what these genes look like on the outside, we can see that we would get 9 round and yellow peas because they contain either all or at least one of the dominant R round gene, and also at least one of the dominant Y yellow color alleles. So they only need to contain one to do that because it's dominant. So that's 9. But then we also get 3 round green peas, and that's because they contain at least one dominant round allele for the round C gene, but they also contain both recessive Ys for the green seed because they have to be green, which means they have to be homozygous recessive for the gene for the color, if that makes sense. And then the same thing applies to the 3 wrinkled yellow seeds. They're homozygous recessive for texture of the seed, but they're either homozygous or heterozygous for the color, but they have to at least contain one big Y allele to express the yellow color. Then we get 1 wrinkled green seed because it's homozygous recessive for both genes, and so hopefully that's understandable. All you have to remember is that for a heterozygous cross of this dihybrid 2-gene cross, you get a ratio of 9:3 to 3:1. So if you know that, you'll be able to look out what you're looking for. But again, it will be different if you're not crossing 2 heterozygous parents together. Their offspring will be different, so be careful about that. You'll get a different ratio. And so I'm just going to quickly go over some ratios just to make sure you know it, because once you know this dihybrid cross, it's quite a big ratio. And the 9:3 to 3:1 ratios, once you see that, you'll be able to quickly realize that this is a heterozygous dihybrid cross, if that comes up in a question. So just be aware about that. And sometimes they may just ask you what kind of ratio you get, or they might get you to write out the question in full, so be aware. But other phenotypic ratios to allow you to work out what kind of cross you're going to have to do before you even have to do it, and also allows you to predict the phenotypic ratios in the first generation and second generation offspring, which you might also need to do. So in the monohybrid cross, where we've looked at before, if you start with heterozygous parents, so like in the example we just did with dihybrid, but in this case only looking at 1 gene compared to 2, you get a 3:1 dominant to recessive ratio. Although you also have to remember for a monohybrid cross, you could cross a homozygous dominant with a homozygous recessive and get a all heterozygous offspring ratio. That's the other kind of ratio you need to know for a heterozygous monohybrid cross. So you either get a 3:1 dominant to recessive ratio or all heterozygous offspring, depending on what your parents are. Another example is codominant, where you cross heterozygous parents, so IA-IB or IA-IB, and for this ratio you get 1:2:1 for the phenotypic ratio, because you're homozygous for one allele, you're heterozygous for another allele, and you're homozygous for the other allele. And in this case, when you're heterozygous in a codominant cross, that will give a different expression compared to homozygous either for one allele or the other allele, because they mix together, instead of where before for a monohybrid cross, if you only have one dominant allele, that's enough to overpower the recessive allele and get a 3:1 ratio. But in a codominant monohybrid cross, the combination of the codominant alleles means that they produce a different result. So the ratio for that is 1:2:1 instead of 3:1, phenotypically. Now also, the other one we learned today, the new one, is dihybrid cross, where you have 2 genes instead. So it's almost like, double the monohybrid. And so instead of 3:1, you get 9:3 to 3:1, as we've just discussed in the video. So I hope that's kind of clear. I hope I've covered dihybrid crosses and just briefly talked about the phenotypic ratios that you need to be aware of. In my next video, I'm going to be covering, where it gets a bit more advanced, linkage and also epistasis, which are the other types of kind of inheritance related things you need to know for A-level. Please like and subscribe. Stay tuned for more videos. Thank you.